Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is at Close Talking. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. On Instagram, the show is at Close Talking Poetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/closetalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show. Hello, and welcome to another all-new episode of Close Talking. I am your co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And I'm your other co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And this is the podcast where we read a poem, we talk about a poem, and then we read the poem again. But before we get to all that, we have a couple of exciting pieces of housekeeping. The first of which is that we got a very nice letter about our episode on Frank Cipasula's Manifesto on Ars Poetica.
Yes, it is from another true friend of the pod, one Dirk Stratton, who happens to be my uncle and is a poet, has been an avid listener and wrote some thoughts. And so we wanted to sort of read them and respond to them. He wrote, Jack and Connor, just listen to your episode, Manifesto on Ars Poetica, as manifestos and Ars Poeticas are two of my favorite genres. This was definitely a twofer. I'm loving this already. The pronunciation of bow or bow in the line. This was something that we had talked about and we really couldn't come to a nice agreement on. Okay, I will not bend my verses into the bow or bow of a praise song. Bow or bow?
In the line, it's spelled B-O-W, but it's not necessarily clear from context whether it's bow, like the bow for an instrument, or a hunting bow, or bow, like bowing towards someone in praise or in supplication.
Yes. And Uncle Dirk also included the spelling bow as in the branch as another third possibility, referring back to an earlier line that included the image of the bow harp. I think a strong case can be made for the second bow being like the first, the noun a bow as in archery. The idea that the harp, the archetypal poetical instrument, developed from the bow strikes me as almost mundane. It seems so obvious. But whatever the true evolution of the harp, linking a poetical weapon with a weapon of war is certainly the move Cipasula wants to make. Jack noted all the violence in the poem, for example. So, not letting the poem become the instrument that creates a praise song seems like a good reading. And then he has a however, but I'm just curious if we have any thoughts. This is there's a lot of sort of complex thinking going on here.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it's helpful to note that the harp has a kind of iconic archetypal status, as Dirk points out, of the sort of essential or quintessential poetical instrument. Okay, so he continues. However, just as obvious, Chipasula likes the pun. The idea of bowing by praising or bowing in praise certainly must be on his mind. But you can't ignore how one would have to bend the bow to make it ready to pluck when creating a song either. Read silently, of course, a reader can get both readings of bow or bow simultaneously. What would be interesting would be to hear how Chipasula reads the poem out loud. Which meaning does he highlight via pronunciation? Which brings us to our quest that I think we have to ask of all of you. We scour the internet for a recording of Chipasula reading this poem, and I came up dry, and Jack came up dry, and there's actually very few recordings of him generally. So if you come across a recording of some kind, please send it our way.
Absolutely. Send it to us on Twitter, either to the show at Close Talking, or to Connor at Hot Sauce Boxed, or myself at Jack Rossiter Munn, or send it to us via email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
Yeah, and one thing I especially like that Dirk noted is in that line, but you can't ignore how one would have to bend the bow to make it ready to pluck when creating a song, which I like because that puts both of them in the same moment where the bow is the thing that's bowing in the kind of bending fashion. Yeah, and when I think about that, then it really does seem to be a kind of both situation. Yeah, so one thing that could sort of be evidence or help us sort of read the pun as both meanings would be if the word were sort of straggling on the end of a line in a sort of enjambment, where because that would sort of suspend the word for a moment in indeterminate meaning. There's an example that I think I mentioned at one point of the first line of Leda and the Swan by William Butler Yeats goes, a sudden blow, the great wings beating still. And then it goes above the staggering girl. But still for a moment, both means they're still beating, but they're also motionless in a sort of stillness kind of sense. But he achieves that pun by the fact that still is the last word on the line. And it's not, in this case, bow harp appears on the end of the line. But when bow or bow appears again, it's not. So that's another thing to think about.
Definitely. And because that line is then immediately followed by, I will put the symbols of murder hidden in high offices in the center of my crude lines of accusation, you can see this as him taking setting the stage for that line by taking the bow of a harp, the harp, as Dirk points out, this really quintessential symbolic instrument of poetry and of the muse, and putting that as like, I'm going to put this symbol in here, and then he tells you what he's going to do with other symbols in the next line. So I think that also leads into that reading of the line.
Yeah, agreed. If any of you have any other thoughts about either the bow and the bow, the bow bow controversy, we want to keep this not a sort of one-sided conversation. So we really appreciate all this, any kind of feedback that you might have.
Absolutely. Yeah, send it all. We love it.
We love it. And another thing that we love, this is possibly the first bit of news, since the first bit of news was the start of the podcast. So we have our second bit of news, which is our podcast, Close Talking, will be featured on a panel at the 2019 AWP, which is the Association of Writers and Writing Programs, which will be in Portland in March of next year. AWP, for those who don't know, is the largest literary conference in the continent of North America, which is a thing that they say on their website, but I also like to say because it sounds pretty cool. But yes, I will be the representative of Close Talking, and I hope to do justice to it. And the panel will be called Literary Podcasting: The Good, the Bad, the Books. And there's going to be 3 other incredible podcasts and podcasters on the panel. One will be the Racist Sandwich podcast, which is an amazing podcast about sort of the intersection of food, race, class, and gender. And also they have a kind of literary element that comes in a lot. And the podcaster who's on Racist Sandwich is Zahir John Muhammad. And then there will be the Between the Covers podcast, which is an amazing interview podcast of authors, which is done by David Naiman. And then the last panelist will be Taz Ahmed, who is a co-host on the hashtag Good Muslim, Bad Muslim podcast, which is about the American female Muslim experience. And yeah, we're both very excited for the opportunity. It's a really good chance to sort of bring our podcast more into a different realm of literary culture and discourse. And if you're in Portland, March, I think 27th through 30th, we will be there, and or at least I'll be there. I think we'll see about Jack, but
I'm hoping to be there for sure.
Yeah, hoping both of us will be there, but definitely I'll be there, and I'll be wandering around when I'm not on the panel, buying too many books. So I would, love to chat about bows and bows.
For sure. Yeah, that's the main reason I'm not sure if I'll go, because I know I'll buy too many books. And so it's mainly like, well, if I don't want to buy too many books, I shouldn't go. But if I go, then I'll buy too many books. And that's a problem in general, just because I'd then have to transport them back to New York.
Yes. For those who don't know, AWP has this insanely large book fair where basically like every publisher, press, from the big ones like Random House to the smallest ones, have a little stand, and they have all their books, and it's just all in one big room, and you walk around and then you buy them all, and then you're like, oh, I'm a writer. I don't actually have the funds for this sort of investment, but
I do not have the money nor the living space to keep up with this habit that I've developed.
Then you're like, I can't move ever because books are the heaviest parts of moving. We're very excited. As we get more details about the time of the panel itself, we'll definitely be letting you know. But please check out all those other podcasts. They're really, truly excellent. And I think we feel very humbled and honored to be sort of a part of them.
Humbled and honored is exactly the way I would put it, because it's very exciting to be in conversation and in community with other exceptional literary podcasts, such as the ones that are going to be on this panel, because they are podcasts that I know Connor and myself both enjoy listening to and both learn a lot from. And so for our little old podcast and little old names to be up there with them feels really, really good and is very exciting. So today on our little old podcast, we've got a not so little old poem, a really exciting poem, If They Should Come For Us by Fatimah Asghar, which I am really excited to talk about.
Yes, it's so good.
So one of the many reasons you may have seen it is because it lends its title to her recent book, If They Come For Us, which was just published in 2018 by Penguin Random House. Fatimah Asghar identifies herself as being Pakistani, Kashmiri, Muslim, queer, and American. She has had her poetry featured all over the place, Poetry Magazine, BuzzFeed, a whole bunch of other high-profile places, as well as being a creator of places for poetry to be featured and of media. She's the co-creator of Brown Girls, which is a web series, Emmy-nominated, and she is one of the 2017 Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg recipients. So very exciting. Also a 2018 Forbes 30 Under 30 in the entertainment category. So
really?
Yep.
Wow,
100%.
awesome.
Along with her Brown Girls co-creator. So big time stuff.
If you haven't seen the web series Brown Girls, you should. It's really good.
No, it's fantastic. And so, yeah, she's definitely somebody to know about, and she does great work, and it is being justly rewarded with accolades and with career success. So that's also exciting. I think without further ado, we should dive into this here poem.
Let's read it.
Yeah. All right. If They Should Come For Us by Fatimah Asghar. These are my people, and I find them on the street and shadow. Through any wild, all wild, my people, a dance of strangers in my blood. The old woman's sari dissolving to wind, bindi, a new moon on her forehead. I claim her my kin, and sew the star of her to my breast. The toddler dangling from stroller, hair a fountain of dandelion seed. At the bakery, I claim them too. The Sikh uncle at the airport who apologizes for the pat down. The Muslim man who abandons his car at the traffic light, drops to his knees at the call of the azan. And the Muslim man who sips good whiskey at the start of Maghreb. The lone Kala at the park, pairing her kurta with Crocs. My people, I can't be lost when I see you. My compass is brown and gold and blood. My compass, a Muslim teenager, snapback and high tops, gracing the subway platform. Mashallah, I claim them all. My country is made in my people's image. If they come for you, they come for me too. In the dead of winter, a flock of aunties step out on the sand, their dupattas turn to ocean. A colony of uncles grind their palms, and 1,000 jasmines bell the air. My people, I follow you like constellations. We hear the glass smashing the street, and the nights opening their dark. Our names, this country's wood, for the fire. My people, the long years we've survived, the long years yet to come. I see you map my sky. The light, your lantern long ahead, and I follow.
This is a great one.
This is a really good one. There are a couple of different words dropped in there that might need a bit of explanation. So Maghreb is the fourth of the 5 daily prayers in Islam. It is known as the West prayer. A kurta is like a really long sort of shirt-like garment that is often worn. Masala basically means God willing, and a dupatta is a type of shawl kind of garment.
And azan is like the sort of basic call to prayer.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think those are the various words I identified as maybe needing explanation.
Yeah, so I'm curious, like, what drew you to the poem, and kind of like, yeah, what are you thinking about it?
I have 2 thoughts. The first was one that crystallized further when I heard an interview with Fatimah Asghar about the question of the title of her series Brown Girls and what brown meant to her. And she was talking about how she wanted it to be a very inclusive and collective term, and that it had a kind of active solidarity about it, and that she wanted it to be about bringing people together, but without any sort of appropriation or erasure, and that it was celebrating difference, but also the connection that could be found in difference. And I feel like there is a strong strain of that running through this poem because it's very much about my people as a refrain that comes through it. And so it's about her connecting with people who, it seems to me, embody a lot of the different aspects of how she feels her identity is formed, different aspects of her own identity that she sees in other people who are not necessarily 100% similar to each other, but have aspects of their personhood that resonate with her on a very deep level. But there's also this other thread that runs through it, which I think creates this really interesting tension in the poem that is drawn out in a very specific way that I want to point to. And that very specific tension is that there is this kind of like dangerous force that hovers over the whole thing, because the title of the poem is If They Should Come For Us. And so it's not just like a personal volition binding, but it feels a little bit like a binding in the face of a malicious external force. And I saw that in a couple of places. I'm also reading a book right now, Hitler's Willing Executioners, which is this sort of groundbreaking history from 1996 that really pointed the finger at average, everyday Germans and made the very strong case, which has now been basically accepted as part of the historical record, that Germany on a whole was complicit in the Holocaust, but more than being complicit, was actually fairly active in it. It wasn't just the SS or Nazi Party officials who were responsible. It really, everyday Germans were much more responsible than had previously been acknowledged. And where I see a connection to that is the lines, "We hear the glass smashing the street and the nights opening their dark." That to me, obviously, Kristallnacht, the night that Jewish businesses and homes were attacked, given its name because of all the smashed glass in the street.
There's also the poem First They Came by Martin, I think, Niemöller, who was a German Lutheran pastor, which I feel like the title is a response to, which you've probably seen in some form before, but it goes, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." That's at least one part of it. And so I think, if they come for us is the first they came for. So it does seem to be like a sort of, and also recently, with like the Trump, since the Trump election, and like the rise of even more explicit like Islamophobia and other and forms of racism and xenophobia that had been there sort of for a long time, and then even more after 9/11. People have sort of adapted that poem as a sort of like, we will not let this happen, to these groups of people. First they came, like, I feel like I've seen on the internet, first they came for this person and I said like no, or I put up my fist or something like that.
Absolutely. No, and I think that poem is totally a reference point, and there are two interesting things I think about that, which is, one, the title here saying "if they should come for us" almost indicates we'll be the first ones they come for. And for someone who embodies so many different highly marginalized identities, I think that's a really interesting place to be writing from. And I think that is in the poem. And there's one aspect in the craft of the poem that I'm curious about how it operates for this, which is that the word "and" does not appear in it. It is always an ampersand. And I'm interested in what that means as a function of "and" is a word that connects two things. And so in a poem where there is so much about what connects the speaker with other people, but also about the force that operates on them and is possibly tearing them apart, what does it mean that the connecting word "and" is not used at all, and that it is replaced with an ampersand?
I don't know if I have the best answer for that. I do think part of it, which is the boring part of the answer, is that there is a kind of trend in some strains of contemporary poetry and in older strains of contemporary poetry. Yusuf Komunyakaa only uses ampersands, for example. And I'm sure there are many others, to use the ampersand. There's actually an interesting interview on Dive Dapper between Kaveh Akbar and Ocean Vuong, and they have a long conversation about ampersands. Yeah, Ocean Vuong says, "I insist on the ampersand in my writing because to me it is a symbol that feels truer to the word "and" than the word "and" itself." This is what he says. He says, in a way, and this is Ocean Vuong talking, in a way the ampersand enacts the plus sign. It performs the figure holding two words together. So the ampersand feels more like itself than its worded rendition. also it is something that illiterate people, like the mother figure in the poem that they were talking about, could recognize. It's a symbol. It's a tangible moment. And I think my insistence on it in my writing is a nod to the tangibility of language and how it has possibilities to be more than itself outside of the alphabet, like, say, in the body. Which is a very fascinating take on the ampersand. I'm sure many of us just like the ampersand because you had to type one thing instead of three things to make it. But I think part of that perhaps speaks to this poem's use of it, in that it's additive, maybe more than like connective.
Interesting.
I was listening to there's a other great poetry podcast that I've mentioned before called the Verses Podcast, which is through the Poetry Foundation, and it's hosted by the poets Denez Smith and Franny Choi, who are wonderful, and they had Fatimah Asghar on the podcast, and she read this poem, so we'll link to it because her reading of it is great, and they talk about it, and it's great. But she said something similar to what you were talking about in that interview, where she was talking about, like, how wide can I make my people? Or like, how wide can I cast this net and include things? But at the same time, she was saying that my people is like a term that's like constantly shifting. It's like, it's moving around. First it means this, then it means that, and so that kind of slipperiness with the inclusivity, in some ways feels like it's more of an additive thing, where rather than like sort of bringing all these people together into one kind of like connected, larger one person, it's like it's a clump of different people who are connected but are all different in different ways, which I think is kind of like I think one of the great parts of this poem too. Just as a small example, which was something that Franny Choi had pointed out, was the moment in the poem where the poem goes, the Sikh uncle at the airport who apologizes for the pat down. And, to claim the Sikh man from a Muslim speaker, they have a fraught history, very violent, that sort of dates back probably further, but certainly in 1947, there was the partition that sort of divided the borders, made the borders between India and Pakistan. And there was just like total bloodshed between Sikh people and Hindu people and then Muslim people, because they had been, this is like the crudest version of history ever, but before the partition, there had been like Muslims in what would then become India, and Sikh people and Hindus in what would then become Pakistan. But then when they were created, suddenly, they were in the quote unquote wrong country. And so that created a bunch of, it was brutal. And so for the poem speaker to claim a Sikh man, or to claim, a Muslim man who's drinking whiskey, which, in like the more traditional kinds of Islam, you don't drink alcohol, is a way of bringing a large net of people without sort of reducing them to like some homogenous thing.
Yeah, definitely celebrating the individuality of these people while still saying there's something about you and I that is connected, without taking away anything from what makes them unique and different. And something else that's interesting about that to me, because as you pointed out, that history is so important to understand about what the actual contours of the relationship around the partition in 1947 are, in terms of how radical an act it is to be claiming a Sikh person and a Muslim person as part of quote unquote my people. But also after 9/11, there was a huge rash of hate crime attacks on Sikh people in New York City because of the visual presentation of what being a Sikh person looks like. There were many, particularly men. But the fact that I think going along with the poem's title of If They Should Come for Us, there's this radical act of inclusion that's happening, but there's also this almost inclusion by necessity because we're going to get lumped together, whether we like it or not in some ways. And I'm not quite sure how that tension plays out. For the most part, I think what's interesting is the multiplicity of identities, as you were pointing to, that each individual who is being claimed seems to be embodying. So there's a lot of contradictions going on, as you said. And that's something that Fatimah Asghar has talked about in terms of herself, because she sees herself as Pakistani and Kashmiri, which is two seemingly very different things. How can you be both? Well, I can. How can you be queer and Muslim? Those seem to be two things that don't go together. Well, here I am. I'm both. And that a lot of what she does in her work is looking at those seeming contradictions in her own different identities and putting them together and really looking at what they mean and how she, in her personhood, synthesizes them, and also then in her work can work through what it means to be these things that many identify from the outside as being contradictory, but which are not necessarily. And I think this poem points to a lot of moments like that, where you have a Muslim teenager snapback and high tops gracing the subway platform. It's like, yeah, you can be all of these different things. You can be so much in one person.
Yeah, and that there's a lot of like the clothes have become such a like problematic signifier of identity, especially for the people that the speaker is claiming. The turban is one great example, and so the deliberate sort of choice to say my compass a Muslim teenager and sort of explicitly be like, this teenager is Muslim but has like high tops and a snapback, teenager vibes, and to put those two together, because obviously they exist, is I think part of the really like cool and subtle work that the poem is doing.
That section in particular reminded me a little bit of the "This is the future that liberals want" meme, which was originally put out by a conservative, which featured a picture of a person in a head covering next to someone who appears to be probably in drag on the subway together. And all of the replies and the spread of it were basically like, yeah, no shit, this is the future liberals want. Like, yes, let's celebrate everyone's difference and maybe everything is okay. Like, Jesus Christ, come on.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that a little bit, but also what's interesting to me is that the various people who are being claimed as my people are also people who are embodying these two like popularly thought of as opposed things, or could be seen to be opposed things, but are actually just synthesizing their own identity out of the way that they are in the world, which seems like a very strong connection to how Fatimah Asghar talks about her own way of being and her own area of like real interest and artistic inquiry.
Yeah, and that's also just like a great, efficient poetic technique where you just have two images or details that seem to be in tension with each other, and by putting them together, one, there's the political import of it, as you've mentioned, but also then the tension sort of creates something larger out of itself, and you can do a lot of work within pretty short amount of time. That's kind of like the first big chunk of the poem, is this like litany, this list of people that she claims as her people, and then there's a sort of turn when she says, if they come for you, they come for me too, and it's we echo the title, and it's sort of the first kind of like the completion of the if they come for us. So it's like they're coming for me too, and I'm not just claiming you all as my people, but also I know that they will come for me too, in some kind of way, that there is this, two forces sort of pushing against each other. And then it's a kind of, the imagery gets very interesting, I think, after that moment, after that sort of turn. So there's, and the scale gets bigger. So we started out with a lot of like individual people, in very specific, like in the subway or whatever. But then it's, if they come for you, they come for me too. In the dead of winter, a flock of antes step out on the sand. They're dupatas, which is the kind of shawl scarf that covers the head. It's another word that might need some clarification. Turn to ocean. A colony of uncles grind their palms, and 1,000 jasmines bell the air. So there's like, the aunties are a flock, the uncles are a colony. Things are turning to ocean. Things are like expanding. Yeah, and then sort of where do we get after that expansion? We get this beautiful line, my people, I follow you like constellations. And this seems to be like the final, there's more to it, but the start of the closing progression, I think, which is, okay, it's not enough to just claim these people as my people, but what are they to me? And what do I do beyond claiming? And I feel like it's a surprising and marvelous moment where the speaker is following these people. So I follow you like constellations, that there's a kind of almost deference, but certainly like a respect and an acknowledgement, rather than like, it's not a leader per se, the speaker, you know what I mean? And that carries through, to the very end, where we have, my people, the long years we've survived, the long years yet to come. I see you map my sky, the light your lantern long ahead, and I follow, I follow. Map is a great verb, and there's this kind of like, by sort of claiming these people as her people, and by sort of joining them together, she sees stars, she sees light, she sees a map of a path to follow. Yeah, I feel like that turn sort of surprised me in like a really great way.
Definitely. I like you point out that it's sort of going against the speaker as leader, because the speaker is the one who is kind of joining all of these people together. But in the joining, it's almost like I join you in my head as part of my people as a concept. And in doing that, I then see all of these people as like examples of ways to be. And that is part of what then forms this, I follow you like constellations. Part of what connects us is then I follow your example. I see through you another way of being that is like my own, and I can use that as a way to feel, more at home in myself going forward through that connection, which I think is really cool. I'm really glad you pointed out the if they come for you, they come for me too in the dead of winter lines as like the breaking point, because I actually, the first time I read through the poem, I underlined those lines. And I noted that I thought, and I'm not quite sure why I used this terminology, but I'll stick with it. I wrote brave line break. And I did that because the way the lines break there, to me, is a little like counterintuitive, perhaps, because it goes, if they come for you, they line break, come for me too in the dead line break of winter, a flock of line break antes. So there's like these very interesting places to break the lines, because if it were me, noob of a poet, I would probably go, if they come for you, line break, they come for me too, line break, because that's another way to like really highlight, oh, this is a turning point in the poem. This is a major point I want to drive home. Like, if they come for you, they come for me too. Ooh, like I'm really hitting you with the knowledge now. And I'm going to break my lines so that you really get those two messages. And it made me think of like the way that actors will sometimes give really creative readings of lines in a way that like breaks them apart, but like really serves the lines well. For some reason, I particularly thought of there's one moment in The Dark Knight when the Joker is getting interrogated, and he tells Batman basically like, when the cops don't need you, the line is, they'll cast you out like a leper, which is a big thematic element of the story, which is basically like, what is the service of Batman? And by the end of the film, he does get blamed for a bunch of stuff. And that's like kind of, he's the Dark Knight. The city can put all of its, responsibilities onto him as like all of the darkness within it. And he can be whatever Gotham needs him to be, basically. But instead of being all straightforward and they'll cast you out like a leper, in the line reading, Heath Ledger goes like,
they need you right now. When they don't, they'll cast you out like a leper.
He like does this pause and then hits that second part of the line with almost like, oh yeah, I just thought of this, which also not only gets across the point of the line, but gives this whole other element of the Joker's kind of like making it up as he goes along, agent of chaos. The line reading then gives you these two levels of what's going on. And I really responded to that here as well, of this like, this is a really brave and interesting line break to start off this whole last section of the poem, because it's the kind of line break that makes me as a reader see something I don't expect, and then I pay more attention, basically, which is a really cool thing that happens when you see it, because it's, if they come for you, they come for me too, in the dead line break of Winter. And so you end the lines with they, so this nebulous aggressive force, and then you end the next line with dead, a really existential threat to the speaker. And so that in many ways packs a much bigger punch than if you say, if they come for you, line break, they come for me too. You and two, like it's an actual couplet. It's like not that exciting or interesting, instead of they, dead. Like these are real. This really drives home both the idea that this is a little bit of a break from where the poem has been into a new section, but it also drives home the reality of the threat that the speaker is under from this nebulous they. So I was really struck by that going into this last section.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And I like that you're talking about line breaks. Always down to talk about line breaks. Yeah, it is there's a lot of harsh ones here. The other interesting part about the poem that comes across when you read it rather than when you listen to it is that there's zero punctuation in the poem. And I think there's no capitalization. So yeah, that makes the kind of syntactical, grammatical flow less clear than it would be, It also sort of adds, I think, broadly some urgency to the poem, because it's sort of, the words are coming in this kind of this constant stream. But in this specific instance, I think you're exactly right. And the other thing that I think is sort of interesting is the line of Winter a flock of, and then it's Auntie step out on the sand. This is actually a lot like the moment in Kaveh Akbar's Waiting for the 12th, which where he has these kinds of lines where the end of a sentence or a phrase sort of begins the line, and then the beginning of the new phrase or sentence ends the line. And so you're sort of like reading the new phrase or sentence before you even realize you're actually doing that. So yeah, so in that poem, there's a moment of earth like a pat of butter on turtle meat, the birch, and then line break curled its tongue. So in there, the birch is kind of starting a phrase, the birch curled its tongue, but it's on the same line as turtle meat. And in here we have in the dead of winter is its own phrase, and a flock of aunties step out on the sand is its own phrase. But the line is of winter, a flock of. And for me, I feel like one thing that this does, as we've been sort of talking about, is just make it like confusing to read, which is helpful in making you read closer. And that's sort of a smart thing to sort of put, when you're having a kind of turn in a poem. I'm not exactly sure the significance of this, but you sort of pair flock with winter. Whereas if there was on separate lines, it'd just be the flock of antes. So now flock is kind of straddling connotations, where it's sort of flock with the winter and then a flock with antes. What do we make of this? Please let me know.
Well, part of what I make of it is just by having of winter a flock of, you naturally start to fill in like some kind of bird, because that's what there are flocks of. But then again, the poem sort of swerves you to the side and says, nope, it's antes. And they step out onto the sand, and then their garments turn to ocean, which is a really cool image.
Mm-hmm.
And to pair this aunties who are turning into ocean with a colony of uncles, that to me calls up a lot of migration and navigation, oceanic travelings of peoples, the creation of colonies in the New World, traveling across the ocean to establish a colony, but also colonies of uncles grind their palms and 1,000 jasmines bell into the air. My people, I follow you like constellations, also calls up like celestial navigation at sea, where you follow the stars to find your way when you're on an ocean-going vessel before contemporary navigation equipment. So you're also then like in this bygone time of navigation and migration. But there's also, I think the most immediate connection most readers would make is to following constellations to freedom, for following the North Star, which is how many slaves escaped captivity in the South, to follow the North Star. And to have those kinds of images and connections going on lends another layer of meaning, where a lot of what's going on in the first part of the poem is not just more individual, but it also feels, to me at least, a little more contemporary. And here we're entering a more timeless space, and it's a more deep, long connection that's going on, not just these like surface level. There's the dupatas, which is clothing, but like there's a lot of clothing discussion in the beginning, and then here we're going into these really eternal levels of our names this country's wood for the fire, like these really elemental levels of connection and symbolism that go on. Like it's the stars, it's the universe, it's the oldest thing there is. It goes beyond just these immediate levels of connection to the real underlying deep like meanings behind these connections, and the depth with which they can be felt.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I also am thinking, I have one interesting thought and one thing that's not really a thought, but more just something that I love, which I'll start with that one, is
Bring
the
it.
line, 1,000 jasmines bell the air, is such a beautiful line. Bell as a verb. I love when nouns become verbs, and it's just wonderful. I think it's especially because I think the way that the image is that the uncles are grinding the jasmines, perhaps, and then they're sort of like being tossed, or they're flying into the air somehow. But the belling, which it's like, obviously jasmine, like flowers have bells, so it's referring in part to that. But then it's kind of like bell, then because it's a verb, it gets more of its sonic resonance, so then it's kind of like they sound the air like a ringing bell. That's a line you keep. That's a line you write down to remember.
Absolutely.
My other sort of thought is, one thing that's interesting about this poem, it has gone perhaps viral, but it's resonated with a lot of people, I think, and it's been spread on the internet because of that resonance. And a lot of that is, of course, because it is speaking, very directly to the moment that's happening right now. I think that title, If They Should Come For Us, is part of, you know, what like makes that happen. But then I kind of think about, you know, it's kind of a, you know, all poems have like political implications or do political work of some kind. The personal certainly is political, but there do seem to be poems that are kind of like what you might call committed politically or something, or like pronouncing a kind of political stance or trying to make a statement, you know, or whatever. And this poem seems to be one of those poems where it's a very bold, and it's a poem I think that's best heard aloud to me. And certainly the lack of punctuation, I think, also emphasizes the sort of the oral nature of it. But one of the ways I think that sort of one of the subtler ways, in a way, that it works as a political poem, because then, and this is, I'm really just flying off the seat of my pants here, but I think to make a political poem, it has to resonate at a higher pitch of the discourse. You know, it has to sort of, when people are thinking in a political mode, like this poem has to sort of touch those registers that make them go, oh, yes, this is what I'm thinking about. You know, you know, like a poem that is about only about looking at daisies, for a very bad cliche example, may have, you know, political implications, maybe talking about the connectedness of people to nature or whatever. But because daisies aren't in the political discourse, or if it's just like a very literal description of these daisies, someone who is kind of like committed politically or in the conversation of the political, it's not gonna hit those bells, or if it might hit other bells. So how do you hit the bells? And I just wanted to sort of think about that a little bit. Part of that is this title, that's sort of making an explicit reference, and that happens again in kind of another way in the body of the poem, which is, "My country is made in my people's image." You know, that's a phrase. You know, the country made in our image is like, I'm not exactly sure where it comes from, but it's a phrase we all know and are familiar with, and is constantly invoked for various purposes. And so that's a very deliberate repurposing, reclaiming, you know, of sort of like existing phrases, sort of for the poem's own ends. And in a quieter way, but still kind of relevant, I think, is a general move to use what you could call ready-made symbols, or using words in a way that's immediately figurative. So there's lots of examples of this, like "A dance of strangers in my blood," the phrase "in my blood." When I see you, my compass is brown and golden blood, my compass. Let's see. I follow you like constellations. You know, I see you map my sky. So those words, like compass is a great example, is immediately used as the symbol of providing direction, right? There's not a moment in the poem where we ever think we're seeing a compass, I think, which we've sort of seen lots of poems where they kind of are gradually working with a literal image, and then at some point they go like, oh, it's a symbol, and then you're like, whoa. This isn't sort of like working on that level. The symbols are kind of like being used sort of more immediately, and it's a familiar one. Like people have said that you are my compass. Like that's in the kind of like symbolic lexicon of many people, I think. And in a similar way, in my blood is a kind of like immediate symbol of like, they're at the core of me, where blood is referring sort of figuratively to one's essential constitution or self in that kind of way. And we never have a moment where we're like, there's blood, like actually, like we see the viscous liquid anywhere, which a poem could do. And to me, the purpose of I think many times that doesn't work in a poem. I feel like one reason why it does work in this poem is because the poem needs to sort of like register at a high political pitch. And even though you can kind of like read it again and again, as we have, and notice these like small little nuances, which are, I think, essential to the poem, it also needs to be like hard hitting on a first listen, and to do that, you can't like dwell on describing the minutia of a compass. That would just be a waste of time. So yeah, I just wanted to draw a little attention to the way that the poem's use of language it that way.
I totally agree. And you're so right that those big splashy moments are the ones that on a first read grab you, and not in an obnoxious hit you over the head with the message kind of way, but in a deepening of connection kind of way. So you hear about my compass, and as you said, that's an immediate connection to like, yeah, we all say things are like, oh yeah, this is my friend who's my rock, or you're my compass. And like, this is in my blood. We have an immediate understanding of what that means, of like, this is really close to me. And the title of the poem, in fact, If They Should Come for Us, that's a pretty quick and close connection. And as you mentioned, my country is made in my people's image. That's almost a joining together of like the religious side of we're all made in God's image. What does that mean? That's something that gets brought up often. Also, my country being made in my image. Was this a country that was made for me? To what degree was it? To what degree wasn't it? To say that my country is made in my people's image is a strong statement from the speaker about how she is thinking about the country that she wants, however close reality is to that. It reminds me of the Bruce Springsteen quote, as most things do, that his career is about tracing the American dream and American reality and the distance between those two things at any time. And a little bit that depends on what is your definition of the American dream. But if you take a progressive, liberal, forward-thinking, forward-looking view of what that is, as I would imagine Fatimah Asghar does, because she includes among her list of identities, she includes American, because it's what she is. And so to say that my country is made in my people's image, after specifically listing the many different people she is considering as members of my people, is a really strong and interesting political statement, both on the level of country-specific politics, but also to the degree it has religious resonance, because she's specifically calling out various individuals who are Muslim, and in a United States of America that is being particularly hostile to Muslims, and has been for the last, I mean, kind of forever, but pretty much even worse since the last, 17 years, and particularly so in the last 3 years. It's getting worse. That's another like radical but easily and quickly decipherable statement that is not specifically saying, it's not coming out and being like the obnoxious Neil Young recorded an entire album of protest music in 2006, which included such gems as Let's Impeach the President for Lying, which like, yeah, okay, cool. That one specifically has kind of come back around and is relevant again, but they were so aggressively, specifically political to that moment. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it just makes it harder for that to be a resonant personal statement in addition to being a strident political message. And I think that this is a really good example of being a meaningful personal statement that is engaged really thoughtfully with politics.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that completely. Do you have any other thoughts? I think, should we read it again?
Yeah, I think we should read it again. All right, this is If They Should Come For Us by Fatimah Asghar. These are my people, and I find them on the street and shadow, through any wild, all wild. My people, my people. A dance of strangers in my blood. The old woman's sari dissolving to wind, bindi, a new moon on her forehead. I claim her as my kin, and sew the star of her to my breast. The toddler, dangling from stroller, hair a fountain of dandelion seed, at the bakery. I claim them too. The Sikh uncle at the airport who apologizes for the pat down. The Muslim man who abandons his car at the traffic light, drops to his knees at the call of the azan. And the Muslim man who sips good whiskey at the start of Maghreb. The lone Kala at the park, pairing her kurta with Crocs. My people, I can't be lost when I see you. My compass is brown and gold and blood. My compass, a Muslim teenager, snapback and high tops gracing the subway platform. Mashallah, I claim them all. My country is made in my people's image. If they come for you, they come for me too. In the dead of winter, a flock of aunties step out on the sand, their dupattas turn to ocean. A colony of uncles grind their palms, and 1,000 jasmines bell the air. My people, I follow you like constellations. We hear the glass smashing the street, and the night opening their dark. Our names, this country's wood, for the fire. My people, the long years we've survived, the long years yet to come. I see you map my sky, the light your lanterns long ahead, and I follow.
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. And whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything is possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.